In the quiet, unassuming heart of the Florida Panhandle, Mike Williams was living the American dream. At 31 years old, he was a successful real estate appraiser, a loving husband, and a devoted father. He had a smile that could light up a room and a kind word for everyone he met. But on the morning of December 16, 2000, as he kissed his wife Denise goodbye and set out for a duck hunting trip on Lake Seminole, no one could have predicted the dark and twisted path that lay ahead. Mike was an avid outdoorsman, and duck hunting was one of his greatest passions. He had been planning this trip for weeks, meticulously preparing his gear and counting down the days until he could get out on the water. As he loaded his boat and set off from the shore, he called out to Denise, promising to be back by noon so they could celebrate their 6th wedding anniversary. It was a promise he would never keep. As the hours ticked by and the sun began its slow descent towards the horizon, Denise began to worry. Mike was never late, especially not for something as important as their anniversary. She tried calling his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She called friends and family, anyone who might have seen or heard from him, but no one had any news. As the evening turned to night and there was still no sign of Mike, Denise knew something was terribly wrong. With a heavy heart and a growing sense of dread, she contacted the authorities to report her husband missing. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, a massive search effort was underway. Law enforcement officers, wildlife officials, and hundreds of volunteers combed the area around Lake Seminole, searching for any sign of Mike. They found his truck parked near the lake, his boat still anchored where he had left it, but no trace of Mike himself. As the search stretched into days and then weeks, hope began to fade. Despite the best efforts of everyone involved, there was no sign of Mike Williams. Jennifer Portman, a seasoned reporter for the Tallahassee Democrat and a consultant for 48 Hours, was one of the first journalists on the scene. She remembers the early days of the search vividly. It was an all-out effort, she recalls. They had helicopters in the air, dive teams in the water, and cadaver dogs on the ground. But as the days went on and there was no sign of Mike, you could feel the hope draining away. As the search continued with no results, rumors and speculation began to swirl. Some people whispered that Mike had run off, leaving his life and his family behind for reasons unknown. Others pointed to the alligators that called Lake Seminole home, suggesting that Mike had fallen victim to these prehistoric predators. Scott Dungy, one of Mike's closest friends, had taken to the skies in a helicopter to aid in the search. From his vantage point above the water, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There were no less than 15 to 20 very large alligators swimming in that area, he remembers. It was eerie, and it definitely made you think about what could have happened. But despite the ominous presence of the alligators, many remained skeptical that they were responsible for Mike's disappearance. Jennifer Portman was one of them. People are attacked by alligators from time to time, she acknowledges. But the idea that one could have taken Mike, a grown man, and completely consumed him without leaving a trace, it just didn't add up. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the official search for Mike Williams was called off. He was listed as missing, but many in the tight-knit community of the Florida Panhandle had already begun to mourn. They couldn't imagine Mike leaving his family, his life, everything he had worked so hard to build. If he wasn't lost out there somewhere, the only other explanation was too painful to consider. But there was one person who refused to give up hope. One person who knew in her heart that something far more sinister had happened to her son. Cheryl Williams, Mike's mother, was convinced that her boy hadn't fallen victim to an accident or an animal attack. She knew Mike, knew his love for his family, his commitment to his work. He would never have just walked away. Cheryl took it upon herself to keep Mike's case alive, to keep searching for answers when everyone else had given up. She compiled a staggering 27 pages of notes and evidence, meticulously documenting every detail of Mike's disappearance. She reached out to wildlife experts, trying to understand the likelihood of an alligator attack. She learned that alligators rarely feed during the cold winter months, when Mike had gone missing. It was another piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. For 9 long years, Cheryl wrote to the governor of Florida every single day, pleading for help, for resources, for anyone to take another look at her son's case. She refused to let Mike be forgotten, refused to let his disappearance be swept under the rug. Her determination, her unrelenting love for her son, would eventually pay off in ways she could never have imagined. While Cheryl fought for answers, life moved on for those Mike had left behind. Shockingly, just 6 months after his disappearance, Denise Williams began the process of having her husband declared legally dead. She argued that the discovery of Mike's hunting waders, his vest, his license in the lake was enough to presume his death. Even more shockingly, a judge agreed. With a stroke of a pen, Mike Williams was declared dead, the victim of a tragic hunting accident. The speed of this decision, the lack of a body or any concrete evidence, raised eyebrows around the community. It was just so fast, remembers Clay Ketchum, Mike's boss and close friend. To lose your husband, your best friend, and to have him declared dead in such a short time, it didn't seem right. There were also questions about the substantial life insurance policies Mike had taken out before his disappearance. Policies totaling over $75 million. Denise wasted no time in collecting on these policies, a move that struck many as cold and calculating. The search for Mike was still going on, and there she was, filing claims, cashing in, recalls Patty Ketchum, Clay's wife. It just didn't sit right. As the years went by and Mike's case faded from the headlines, Cheryl Williams kept pushing, kept fighting. Her efforts finally caught the attention of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement in 2004. Investigators met with Cheryl, listened to her concerns, reviewed her meticulously kept notes. What they found was a web of inconsistencies and unanswered questions that couldn't be ignored. One of the lead investigators on the reopened case was Derek Wester, then with the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. He remembers the moment he first started to suspect that Mike's disappearance was more than just a tragic accident. It was probably the first night we talked to Miss Cheryl, he recalls. She had everything written down, every little detail, and as she's going through it all, you start to see all these things that just don't add up. One of the biggest red flags was the life insurance policies. The last one, a whopping $1 million policy, had been sold to Mike by none other than his best friend Brian Winchester. Winchester had been an insurance agent, and he and his then-wife Kathy had been inseparable from Mike and Denise since high school. The fact that he had sold Mike such a large policy just before his disappearance raised all kinds of alarms. There were other details that didn't add up too. The waders that had been found in the lake, the ones that had been used to declare Mike dead, were in surprisingly good condition for having been in the water for 6 months. The flashlight found with them still worked, small details perhaps, but ones that started to paint a very different picture of what might have happened to Mike Williams. As the investigation kicked into high gear, suspicion began to turn towards two of the people closest to Mike, his wife Denise, and his best friend Brian Winchester. In the years after Mike's disappearance, the two had divorced their respective spouses and married each other, a fact that raised more than a few eyebrows around town. Investigators learned that before marrying Denise, Brian had told his ex-wife Kathy that Denise had been involved in Mike's disappearance. He claimed it had been Denise's idea, that she had asked him to help make Mike go away. Despite these explosive allegations, the case against Denise and Brian remained largely circumstantial. Without a body, without any physical evidence tying them to a crime, investigators knew they would have a tough time making any charges stick. The case went cold again, but the suspicions around Denise and Brian never quite went away. It would take another 12 years and a shocking act of violence for the truth about Mike Williams to finally come to light. In 2016, Brian Winchester and Denise Williams' marriage had deteriorated to the point of divorce. One morning, as Denise was on her way to work, Brian emerged from the back of her car with a gun. He forced her to drive to a remote location, where he held her hostage for hours. Denise managed to talk Brian down and convince him to let her go, but the incident was enough to send him to jail on charges of kidnapping. It was the break investigators had been waiting for. With Brian facing a lengthy prison sentence, they approached him with an offer. Come clean about what really happened to Mike Williams, and they would consider a plea deal. Backed into a corner, Brian finally cracked. In a series of stunning confessions, he admitted to what many had suspected for years. On that cold December morning in 2000, Brian Winchester had lured his best friend Mike Williams out onto Lake Seminole. Under the guise of a hunting trip, he had pushed Mike overboard, and in a moment of panic shot him in the head with a shotgun. He then transported Mike's body to a remote location, Carr Lake, where he buried him in a hastily dug grave. But the most shocking part of Brian's confession was still to come. The whole plot, he claimed, had been Denise's idea. She had grown tired of her marriage to Mike, but hadn't wanted to go through the hassle or public humiliation of a divorce. In Brian, she had found a willing accomplice to help her get rid of her problem permanently. The life insurance policies, Brian said, were Denise's way of making sure she was taken care of after Mike was gone. Armed with Brian's confession and the location of Mike's body, the FDL launched the most comprehensive search operation in its history. Teams of investigators, forensic experts, and cadaver dogs descended on the remote area around Carr Lake, meticulously combing the dense swampland for any sign of Mike's remains. It was a painstaking process, but after weeks of searching, their efforts paid off. On a small island in the middle of the lake, they found a makeshift grave. Inside were the skeletal remains of Mike Williams, still wearing the wedding ring he had put on 18 years before. The discovery of Mike's body and the confession of Brian Winchester was enough to bring charges against Denise Williams. In May 2018, a full 17 years after she had stood by and watched as her husband was declared dead, Denise was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory after the fact. Her arrest sent shockwaves through the Tallahassee community, where she had been living a seemingly quiet life with her and Brian's daughter. The trial that followed was a media circus, drawing national attention and casting a harsh light on the woman at the center of it all. Prosecutors painted a picture of Denise as a cold, calculating murderer, a woman who had valued money and a fresh start over the life of her husband. They pointed to the life insurance policies, the rushed declaration of Mike's death, and her quick remarriage to Brian as proof of her guilt. Brian, in a plea deal that spared him a murder charge, took the stand against his former wife. In chilling detail, he recounted the plot to kill Mike, the moment he had pulled the trigger, the grim task of burying his best friend in an unmarked grave. Through it all, Denise sat stone-faced, betraying no emotion as the court heard how she had orchestrated her husband's murder. In the end, it took the jury just 8 hours to reach a verdict. Denise Williams was found guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in gasps and sobs as the verdict was read, the culmination of a nearly 2-decade-long journey for justice. For Cheryl Williams, who had fought so long and so hard to uncover the truth about her son, the verdict was a bittersweet victory. "I never gave up," she said through tears outside the courthouse. "I couldn't give up. He was my son and he deserved justice." The conviction of Denise Williams closed a chapter in one of the most notorious and long-running murder cases in Florida history. But for those closest to Mike Williams, the pain of his loss will never fully heal. "It changes you," says Clay Ketchum, Mike's boss and close friend. "To have someone you love taken from you like that, it shakes your faith in the world, in people." Today, Mike Williams rests in a proper grave, his memory honored by the many lives he touched. His story, one of love, betrayal, and the unrelenting pursuit of justice, stands as a testament to the power of a mother's love, the bonds of friendship, and the indomitable human spirit. It's a reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of coming to light. As Denise Williams serves out her life sentence and Brian Winchester faces his own lengthy prison term, the world keeps turning in the quiet corner of the Florida Panhandle that Mike Williams once called home. But for those who knew and loved him, the memory of his kind heart, his gentle spirit, and his unending devotion to his family and friends will never fade. In the end, that is the true legacy of Mike Williams, a life cut short, but a love that endures beyond the grave.